Thank you very much, everyone, for joining for watching that video special. And we are now going to be joined by Sarah Botstein and Congressman Brian Baird to answer any questions that you have in regards to the role of service in our nation's founding, in our nation's history, its importance to our democracy, how you can make service a central part of your 250th celebration, and really cement that legacy of service and that culture of service as a core American value and part of who we are for the next 250 years to come. So with that being said, we probably have some new people joining us, as well as people who are staying on who watch the video. This video itself, video special, is available on YouTube and on our website, as well as on the American Revolution Engagement and Resource Center as well. Additionally, when this video was created, we created a couple of educator discussion guides, as well as a family, community, and school engagement and activity resource. So if you are an educator or you know an educator in your life, I'd invite you to utilize this video as a starting point for a really informative conversation with your class around the role of service, civics, and our history. And I can share the details for that. You'll get a follow-up email as well, details on how to access all of these resources too. So with that being said, I'd like to invite Brian and Sarah to join us here. And, hi, sir. I'm going to ask you to unmute it.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Good to see you again.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm super. Great to see you.
Great to see you. I'm in a loud New York City location, so I have my headphones on to make the sound a little better for everybody.
That's what we can all relate to that.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking time. And Sarah, let me just begin by thanking you for the work you've done, your service as a journalist, as a filmmaker, as a documentarian, as a historian. You have enriched all of our lives and our culture in so many ways for many years now, and the latest documentary is just breathtaking. And
thank you.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and we think a lot about the different ways over our history that service has surfaced as an important and core American value, and I think it was absolutely there at our founding. So I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful.
Julie, do you have some questions for us or comments?
We have some questions here in the chat, and then I also have a number of questions prepared. I could have questions for the two of you ongoing for days, so I hope that this will prompt some other questions for people as well. The first question we have from David Owens: how do we improve our calls to action and service among citizens of all ages, youth to those retired?
Well, Brian, do you want to go first, or do you want to hear my filmmaking view?
Well, I can start. I think the best way to do the call to action is make it much more public. When we honor non-military service in our country, we typically have, say, a single service award that we give to one person one night a year at a banquet or something, which is admirable in intent, but just doesn't reach broadly. We need to feature examples of people who serve every day all around our communities and from all walks of life, not just the one service award hero or service award winner, but the everyday people who serve every day. And I think that's a good place to start. That's what I talked about at the end of the dialogue with my colleagues from Congress. And if we start doing that, then everybody will say, hey, there is a place for me here and I can make a difference.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I mean, I always say that the last 4 or 5 films that I've worked on, whether it's the Vietnam War and the veterans who came home from war and felt they had an obligation to express their views about the war, having served admirably in the military, to how our immigration policy has intersected with our foreign policy, to the American Revolution, I think inspiring children in particular before they're 18 to be involved in service and community as they become old enough and mature enough to exercise their right to vote, sits at the center of a lot of our educational materials for students to learn our history and then be excited about their role in government, large, medium, as small, as they get older. And that for those that go to public school, their public school boards often have board members who they know, parents of their friends. What's involved in being a member of your local school board? What's involved in being a member of your local library? What does it mean to have a local fire department? How are the tiny, very tangible pieces of government related to you? And then I think for those, if we inspire children to do that, then by the time they're active and engaged voters, they get much more involved.
Sarah, I totally agree with that. And if you go to almost any high school or junior high in the country, you're going to find a trophy case for athletics. But
100%.
only a few kids can make it into that, because you not only have to be athletic, you have to win championships. And wouldn't it be wonderful if in all of our schools, the students themselves made posters or video displays honoring people in their community who serve, not just the famous people we all know, but the community in their own community, and especially young people themselves. That's a way to start, as you're saying, Sarah, inspiring this from early on.
Right. I think we have found that for in our country, where we have so many different kinds of schools available to children, that the faith-based schools do a lot of that as part of their curriculum. The Christian schools, the Jewish schools, there is an infrastructure sometimes in the faith-based communities and around other religious institutions that encourage young people to be involved. And they do have service awards, and they do. So I think in our public school system and the more traditional separation of religion and education schools, I think it would be wonderful to institute that. And I have two kids who are still in school, and the high schooler does now get more involved in the communities. And I think that's been really powerful and exciting. And she cares a lot about the community that she lives in because of that service.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. I'm gonna ask a question that I had here, and going back to, I love, Sarah, when you talk about the founders putting it all on the line, risking their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. And
Right.
Brian also has pointed out to me from, I think, day one that we've been working together, that in the Declaration of Independence, those words are capitalized: lives, fortune, and honor, really emphasizing that risk. What risks did the founders face that modern politicians may not face?
Do you want me to go first? Do you want to go first?
Sure, Sarah, that'd be great.
I don't know. Okay. I mean, they were risking everything, right? I think it's hard for us to imagine. First of all, the founders were not famous household names yet, right? They didn't know how it was going to turn out. They were figuring it out as they went. They were very vociferously debating themselves about how this might all work and what might happen. So I think it's very hard to put ourselves in their position, because now you're part of a working government, sometimes a non-working government, that has had different iterations for 250 years. Then they actually had a blank slate. They knew what they didn't want it to be, but they didn't know what it was going to be. And they actually really weren't sure they would have liked some of the ways that it has turned out, right? And there were things about the British government and the monarchy and the House of Lords and the way that the monarchy intersected with a more democratic world that seemed like a pretty good idea at the time. So when they say they wanted to sacrifice everything, it's because they kind of already were. It's important to remember that some of the founders were very wealthy and powerful, and were big land speculators. They had a lot at stake economically with what happened, but they also really didn't want to have a monarchical situation where there were subjects and not citizens. And they were students of the Enlightenment, and they were very interested in this notion of citizenship, even if that was a very tiny slice of the population at the time. So I think for me, it's important to remember that they debated amongst themselves. They weren't sure how it should go. They knew the things they didn't want it to be. And they did feel that sacrifice, unity, a sense of government and a governing power was hugely important. And they were already dealing with the dynamics of the state and local governments. So some of the ways that we've seen our government come together and splinter apart, and the kind of rhetoric around a strong federal government or strong state governments, and the debates that we have even today, they were having with, I think, a little bit more unity and a much better understanding, honestly, of civics. I think that is the other piece of what we talk a lot about on the road, wherever we are, whatever the politics of the community or the state that we're in, is just, I don't think there's a good argument for not teaching civics. And I think we're at a point in our country where a lot of people don't really understand how the government works. Again, small, medium, and large.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Sarah just said. And just add a couple of things. It's just so important to understand that when people criticize the king, that was an act of treason. And acts of treason can get you beheaded and your head put on a stake. They weren't worried that they would get a primary opponent in the next election. They were worried that they'd be drawn and quartered. They realized that everything was on the line. But they also had another fear, and the other fear was that they would fight this revolution. But what kind of, Sarah, what you were saying, what would happen after that? What kind of government would they institute? Would they have? Could the people govern themselves? That was the revolutionary idea. And they were worried that the people could screw it up, or that another form of monarch would emerge, chosen by the people, but in a dictatorial, autocratic fashion. And so they not only put their lives on the line and their property, they put the future on the line on a kind of a wager that says, we think the people can do the right thing for one another, not just for a sovereign, not just for an autocrat. And I think that's super important. On the civics front too, I would add this. I've done a lot of civics education, as Sarah has, and probably many on this call. If I had one lesson I would want young people to take away, it wouldn't actually be how many House members or senators there are. That's somewhat interesting, but it would really be, if you want freedom, you have to bank on democracy. And if you want democracy, a democratic republic, it has to be founded on service. Service by the people, service for the people, that we're all in this together, not to self-enrich, not to gain power, but to make life better for everyone. And that's the key civics lesson I hope we can convey.
I completely agree. And it's beautifully said. And I do think the stakes were enormously high for them, and the stakes of a working democracy are incredibly high for us.
Yes, beautifully said.
Wonderful. So our next question, a question for Sarah. You mentioned that founders had many differences, but were still able to balance one another in shaping the country. After immersing yourself so deeply in the history, what lessons do you think we can apply today to foster that kind of healthy balance in our civic life?
I think the role of Congress is where I would put my focused energy to help people understand. The founders debated themselves. They didn't always agree, but consensus and a balance of power were very important to them, even amongst the different points of view of how that should go. And when it comes to the distance between the Declaration and the Constitution, the role of Congress as a representation of the people was a way that they could come to some consensus between themselves about the role of government and the role of a federal government versus the states. And so I think in the 20th and 21st century, we've lost that. And that sits at the feet of both parties, in my view. So Congress is meant to represent the people and check executive power rather than be a megaphone for executive power. And I think we've lost our way with that. And so the founders were able to vociferously and very civically, and they debated in a very grown-up way. They were highly educated debaters, and they were not a bunch of terribly sore losers. You just look at Jefferson and Adams to understand that. They really felt very differently about a lot of things and loved each other very deeply. And I think there is something to be learned for that, as well as understanding the balance of power. I think Brian is right. It's not how many senators you have and how many representatives, but it is important to understand how important our founders thought the Congress should be, not the president. They were moving away from a monarchy, so they were moving away from centralized power in that way. And I think we should be reminded of that every 4 years when everyone pays a lot of attention to what's going on in American politics.
Right. And Sarah, that you talked about the willingness to come together, work together, and not be a sore loser. It's funny. Sometimes people say, well, we're wedded to the Constitution and we won't compromise. Well, wait a second. The Constitution itself was the result of compromise. The
100%.
Declaration of Independence was an edited document, edited by committee with passions on both sides, with changes almost up to the final draft. And so that sense of being willing to collaborate across differences. And then when you look at the example of Washington, not only in the field did he gather information from other leaders and listen closely, but when he presided over the Constitutional Convention, he wanted to make sure everybody had a fair say. He didn't put his finger on the scales and say, I won the war, I'm in charge, now do what I say. He listened, he made sure people were respectful, and then in his final act, when he resigned from Congress, it wasn't his final act because he served even after the presidency. I mean, when he retired from the presidency, his farewell address, he warns against the dangers of factions, against getting so wedded to one party versus another party that we forget the common interest, the shared good, and that we then build alliances with foreign powers because those will favor our party or the next. So he's adamant that we have to collaborate, we have to compromise, we have to work together, and that we can't split into our side versus your side. It's all of our sides.
He was very smart and thoughtful and a truly great leader, even when he wasn't a perfect general or military man, or there were flaws in his character and things that should not be admired about George Washington. And then there is more than should be admired about George Washington. We always say in Making the Revolution, he's the most important man in the story, regardless of the mistakes he made and the flaws he had. And we stand on his shoulders, and we have a lot to learn from his leadership, both in terms of the military and in terms of the government. And one of the things that I tell my children all the time, and that I've really taken to heart in the work that we do, is that great leaders in history have always known when to walk away from power. And those are the leaders that you look back on history with great admiration for. And the leaders who try to hold on to power for too long more likely have tragic endings. And so he walked away both from political power and military power in a very grown-up and elegant and unifying way that I think is one of the great moments in American history, done twice.
Yes, exactly right.
Just going on that and following up with those questions, I'm curious in terms of, as we refer to both parties in our two parties all the time, do you think the founders intended for us to have a two-party system and to be working along party lines as we are today? Or where in our history did that really change, and that we started to see that be the makeup of our government? And how the documents were written really, were they written with that in mind and for this potential to be happening?
Well, the word party, the word political party never appears in the Constitution, but they formed into factions pretty quickly, Washington's admonition notwithstanding. I mean, the first elections after Washington were partisan affairs. And it has been thus. They were not necessarily wedded to a two-party system or a multi-party system, and they did not include that anywhere in the documents. It's still to this day, you can't find the word political party in the documents. But it evolved as human nature, and the framers anticipated this. They debated much in the Federalist Papers and the debates of the Constitution, but Washington's admonition was, even if you form into parties, watch out, because your loyalty will begin to shift.
Yeah, and the only thing I have to add to that is I think to the question of how it's changed over 250 years, I think the most noticeable moments of change, and I could be wrong about this, Brian, but what I would answer is it changes enormously after the Civil War, it changes after the First World War, it changes after the Second World War, and it changes after Vietnam. Our wars have turned how we see politics and citizenry and the country upside down, and that starts with who has the right to vote, who has a voice in our government, and the geopolitics and the domestic situation around America's major wars.
Yes. And the other thing I would add is there's a temptation to say, let's look back at a bygone era where everybody was happy and everybody got along. The film you so beautifully produced, Sarah, you talk about basically a civil war, an ongoing struggle. But we're at our best. It is true that there have always been tensions, bitter rivalries, fistfights, duels, etc., people killing one another. But we are at our best when we transcend that and we come together for the common good, for the greater good. And as you pointed out, Sarah, when we include more Americans, not less, when we bring everybody into the tent and we work together. So it's never been perfect, but it is a union that we can make more perfect over time.
They wanted it to be more perfect over time, and I think certain pieces of not just the delicate balance of the government, but the tenets of they really believed in education, they really believed in virtue, they really believed in the separation of church and state, given what had happened in Europe and around the world over time. They wanted certain separations and balances and guardrails to create the conditions for the most, I think, constructively united, but yet able to debate group of people.
Yeah.
I mean, I may be putting a very rose-colored glasses on it, but that's how I like to think about it.
Well, I think I couldn't agree more. And I think it's in the language. You talked about civics education. Begin with the first three words, we the people,
right,
in order to form a more perfect union. That's the Constitution, how it begins. And so we can ask ourselves as citizens, as Americans, how is what I am doing today or what I am saying today helping form a more perfect union? If I'm being vitriolic and mean and nasty and attacking the other side, how can that form a more perfect union? Doesn't that divide us? And then, establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. That's the civics lesson. How can we form a more perfect union?
And what makes us virtuous?
Yes.
And studying the great works of history. I think they really believed in virtue and education. That those words and that rhetoric comes up over and over again in all the ways the founders were thinking, even Thomas Paine, and in the important document of Common Sense.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have a question about K-12 schooling and curriculum here. How do we include service learning in K-12? And I might just say not just curriculum, but schooling in general. I'll expand that.
What do you think, Brian?
Well, I think part of it is you could start with the premise, why are we getting an education? We sit kids down, we start teaching them stuff, but there's got to be purpose to that. There's got to be that we're learning not just so we can get ahead of the next guy, not just because it's a good place to send our kids during the day, but we're educating people. Jefferson, in a powerful quote, said, "Establish a law for educating the common man." We should have said common person, but this was fundamental, as Sarah was saying. Education is the foundation of a democratic republic, and so service is part of that foundation as well. To inspire young people that this is part of who we become, and virtuous people, knowledgeable people for the greater good. And then I guess I would say letting them embody that by acts of service in their school and in their community. So it's not just a lesson to be learned and tested. It's a lesson to be embodied and enacted in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson plans that we create and the way that we use historical documentary film footage and curriculum on any film we make, we hope ultimately has a complicated message of patriotism, which doesn't mean America is just great all the time, but hopefully has students, parents, teachers, citizens interested in our history to see what we've done well and what we haven't done well, and how we can ask questions and learn. And some of that always ends up being in terms of service, and not just in terms of military service, but in terms of being involved in your local communities. So that, I think, comes through as a secondary piece of the lesson plans and the questions that we're asking students to think about.
Yeah, we should add to this, Sarah, that in addition to your marvelous documentary, there are accompanying materials that go with
Yeah.
that. Educators who are watching this, or parents who are watching this, homeschoolers, whatever, you can go to the website of the American Revolution or Our American Story, and you can find work we've done collaboratively with Sarah and Ken and David to create lessons and thought discussions, etc. And those are free, and you can follow those. And so too, it's free to download the toolkits and examples of how to create service exhibits in people's own schools. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can go there, and they're very provocative, evidence-based tools to incorporate in lesson plans in schools or at home or in community.
Absolutely. And we do that both with, Our American Story and the work that we do with you, and also with PBS Learning Media. Ken always says, and I completely agree, we spend our lives working in public television because the films live on in the classroom. And part of the educational materials for most films, there are one or two lesson plans that dovetail into this question of citizenship, in getting involved. What would you do? That sort of thing.
And just as the founders stepped forward as a small group, which led to the big change that we're enjoying today, any teacher, any student, any community member can begin this process of creating service exhibitions, of communicating the importance of service in their own community. And this will expand and grow, and others will say, I like that. How can I do it too?
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know if you mind if I just add in, my background actually is in service learning and education. And to add on to this, I think, and it's been a movement for a while in education, but I think it being more apparent and people knowing the benefits of service learning to the student and the growth of the student and their engagement in classrooms. Service learning is an excellent tool to develop those social emotional skills that we really want young people to have, to connect what they're learning through authentic experiences in their community. And there's just so many benefits to incorporating service learning into the classroom on that student and then on the community as a whole. If we can find a way to provide our schools and our teachers with the capacity and the resources in order to embed service learning into their pedagogy, will just be beneficial for our society and our communities long term. And that's what I love about the tools that are created with PBS Learning. I know a lot of teachers that love and value all of those tools. So thank you very much for that, and for that emphasis and that focus on connecting history with the present and how that works in our communities.
Julie, I would just add too that almost everyone watching this is probably engaged in some form of service, and in either at their work, as volunteers in a service club of some sort. They can tell their own story in their own community and in their own school using these tools. So those resources are free and available to everyone. And the more we use it, the more the message gets out, the more people see it, the more people feel good about their democracy and their community, and the better off we are.
Communities, and there's resources for families as well, family discussion
Exactly right.
too. So please check those out.
Yeah.
And so I think our last question here from Tavin, how can we condense the messaging in the film and conversation for TikTok, Reels, and I'm guessing that's the next generation? How do we condense this and get the word out?
Well,
Sarah?
I can say from the Ken Burns world what we've done. There's a platform that we launched more than around 10 years ago, I would say, called Ken Burns Unum, which is, out of many one. So Ken really loves that word and that notion. And we've taken our work over the last nearly 50 years and figured out how to play short clips from our films. They're not quite as short as TikTok, but they're very short and they're sometimes thematically based. So if you're interested in leadership, if you're interested in elections, if you're interested in race, if you're interested in war, if you're interested in women, if you're interested any kind of big theme, overarching theme in American history, if you go to Ken Burns Unum, you can see short clips from our films, different important thought leaders talking about those themes, sometimes in conversation with Ken, sometimes on their own. That's really a platform whose mission it is to make our films short and condensed, to highlight the important themes, to have the past be in conversation with the present in a very real way. And we leave it to our marketing people to figure out Instagram and TikTok. I'm too old to know how to do that, but I do know we try on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are a little bit antiquated and old fashioned and asking people to sit down and really give their time and attention to our history the way they would a book.
I love that resource you talked about, Sarah. It's really wonderful. I would just add that one of the things I think we can do is encourage young people to be more intentional and more discerning in the content they produce and in the content they consume. When you look at what goes viral, it's often mean, it's often somebody's misfortune, it's often something negative. That's not good for us to consume that all the time. It's not good for us to consume it any of the time. But if we're producing content, let's make sure it's generous, kind, contributing content. Let's make sure what we consume is constructive and what we share and like is constructive. If we do that, you can transform the culture. So start making TikToks about people engaging in acts of kindness and generosity and compassion. Start forwarding and liking things that show that, and don't consume the negative stuff. It's not good for us.
I agree.
Wonderful. We have one more question here. Are you guys okay for one more question? I know I said that was our last one, but we'll do one more. For Sarah again, was there a particular moment or experience that led you to pursue this work and dedicate yourself to telling these stories?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I got very lucky nearly 30 years ago. I had graduated from college and I had a job working in New York in a PR advertising agency, and public television was one of the accounts I got put on as a young person. And instead of going to graduate school, I moved to a tiny town in New Hampshire to work for Ken on a film about the history of jazz. And I didn't know anything about jazz music. It was absurd. I could barely have told you the difference between Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And on the course of working on that film, I realized so many things about American history and culture that I didn't know. The idea that you could teach and think about and understand American history through so many different lenses. I was an American studies major in college. I've always loved the intersection of politics and literature and film and music and just who we are as Americans. And so really it wasn't one thing. It was more sort of these big, complicated either moments in American history or subjects that are uniquely American and how they can help us understand ourselves in the present and make a brighter future. So it really wasn't one thing. I'm very lucky because every few years I completely change what I think about and who I know and who I work with. And at the same time, one film weaves interestingly to the next, and they all are in conversation with each other. So if I'm making a film about Prohibition in 2009, I can't understand how much a film about prohibition is going to impact a film I make about the American Revolution, but somehow they do. So I've been very, very lucky. I feel really privileged to do the work that I do. And also to be able to not just make films, but to work with our extraordinary people. We have a very collaborative art form, but again, with teachers and educators and people who work and believe in public media around the country.
You know, I love that answer, Sarah, and we're all fortunate that your career took that path because of the wonderful ways you've contributed. The thing that came to my mind, Julie, when you asked the question is the great quote from Martin Luther King when he said, "Everybody can be great because everybody can serve." And the key insight is that each of us has some talent, some interest that we can give back to help others and make the world a better place. And in my experience, and I think everybody, doing so connects you to such good people, to such kind and generous and talented people who are giving of themselves to help others. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that I know more fulfilling than that. To commit yourself to a cause with purpose that benefits others is the best thing you can do with your life and pays dividends like you can't even imagine, that are far more important and satisfying than just some monetary compensation, though that's important. But even then, what can we do with that to help make the world a better place?
I absolutely agree.
Sarah, thank you
Thank you
for
so
being
much
part of
for
this
your
today.
attention. It's really a
And thanks
pleasure
to
to talk
everybody
to
who's
you.
viewing and for all your service. I know people are doing so many good things.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everybody.
Bye.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you, Brian.